Chief Alumide did not walk, he paraded. His agbada was woven from the finest silk, dyed in the deepest indigo of the gods. Around his neck hung coral beads so heavy they forced him to stand tall, a physical manifestation of his ego. He was the wealthiest man in the 7 villages, a man who believed that even the rain waited for his permission to fall. The festival of the new yam was approaching. The air smelled of roasting tubers and palm wine. As Alumide marched toward the village square, a shadow darted from behind a baobab tree. It was an old woman, her skin like cracked river mud, her back bent into a permanent question mark. She carried a small calabash of palm oil. As the chief's retinue swept past, she tripped. The calabash shattered. A single, dark red spray of oil landed on Alumide's pristine, white-embroidered leather boots gifted to him by a traveling merchant from the north. The music of the flutes died. The village held its breath. "You withered vine," Alumide roared. His voice was the crack of a whip. "You have stained the purity of my station with your filth." "Mercy, great chief," the woman croaked, her forehead touching the dirt. "The sun was in my eyes. I am but a dry leaf in the wind." Alumide didn't just scold her. He took his ceremonial staff, topped with a golden leopard, and pressed it into her shoulder, pinning her to the earth. "A dry leaf should be burned. Guards, take her oil-soaked rags and cast them into the spirit shrine. Let her shiver in the night, so she remembers the cost of blindness." As the guards dragged her away, the woman didn't cry. She looked back, her eyes suddenly turning the color of polished silver. "The sun sets for every king, Alumide. Tomorrow, may you find the warmth you denied the old." The crow of the wrong morning. Alumide woke not to the soft fanning of his servants, but to the sharp peck of a vulture's beak near his ear. He bolted upright, but his body felt heavy, rusted. He wasn't on his bed of leopard skins. He was lying in the middle of the village refuse heap, surrounded by charred yam skins and broken pottery. His magnificent agbada was gone. In its place was a tattered, foul-smelling loincloth that barely covered his shriveled thighs. "Who dares?" he tried to bellow, but his voice was a thin, wheezing whistle. He looked at his hands. They were the hands of a ghost, bony, trembling, and covered in the gray ash of 1,000 fires. He crawled to a nearby stream to wash the filth from his eyes. The reflection that looked back was the very woman he had humiliated. He had her face, her cataracts, her broken spirit. Panic seized him. He scrambled toward his palace, his bare, cracked heels bleeding on the sharp stones. At the palace gates, his own brother, Tund, stood guard. "Get away, beggar," Tund shouted, raising a spear. "This is the house of the great chief."
"Tund."
"It is I, your blood," Alumide cried, falling to his knees. Tund spat on the ground near Alumide's face. "My brother is inside, preparing for the feast. You are just a heap of bones looking for a grave. Move, before the dogs find you." Alumide looked up at the balcony. There, dressed in his indigo silk, sat the old woman. She held his leopard staff. She looked down at him with his own eyes, cold, arrogant, and mocking. She raised a cup of palm wine in a silent toast to his misery. The charity of the smallest. The hunger was a fire in his belly that wouldn't go out. Alumide wandered the market, the same market where yesterday he had demanded tribute. Now he was lower than the village goats. "A morsel," he pleaded with the fishmonger. "Just a tail of a dried herring." The fishmonger laughed. "I give to the ancestors, not to living corpses. Beg elsewhere, mother of bad luck." He sat by the dusty road, his pride rotting faster than his rags. Then a small child approached, a girl no older than 5, wearing nothing but a string of waist beads. She held a small, charred piece of roasted corn. She looked at Alumide's hollow eyes. Without a word, she broke the corn in 2. She gave him the larger half. Alumide looked at the grain. In his palace, he would have fed this to the pigs. Here it looked like a feast of gold. He reached out to take it, but a voice echoed in the wind, a whisper only he could hear. "To eat is to survive. To give is to return." The first act of kindness requires you to sacrifice the very thing you need to stay alive. Alumide looked at the girl. She was skinny. Her own ribs were visible. She was giving him her only meal. For the first time, the chief felt the weight of his own cruelty. He pushed the corn back toward the girl. "No, little one," he rasped, his heart cracking. "You are the future. I am but the dust of yesterday. Eat and grow strong." The girl smiled, and as she took the corn, a faint warmth spread through Alumide's frozen chest. He didn't turn back into a chief, but the sores on his feet stopped bleeding. Shall I continue with chapters 7 through 9, where Alumide must face the wrath of the forest to save a life? The whispering thorns. The warmth from the child's smile faded as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long, jagged shadows across the savannah. Alumide, trapped in the fragile frame of the old woman, felt the night's chill settle into his brittle bones. In his palace, he would have called for a fire of cedarwood. Here, he huddled under the eaves of a granary, shivering. As the village slept, a low, rhythmic wailing drifted from the edge of the forbidden forest, the bush where the ancestors breathed and the leopards hunted. It was the sound of a mother in agony. Alumide's instincts, those of a ruler used to ignoring the cries of the poor, told him to stay hidden. But his new heart, softened by the child's corn, forced him to stand. He followed the sound to the village well. There, he found Amina, a widow whose land he had seized only a moon ago for a tax she couldn't pay. She was frantic, clawing at the earth near a dense thicket of devil's thorn, a plant with needles as long as fingers and coated in a numbing sap. "My son," she cried, seeing the ragged figure of the chief. He chased a runaway goat into the thorns. "He is trapped, and the night stalkers are coming." Alumide looked at the thicket. Even a strong man would fear those thorns. In his current state, his skin was like parchment. One scratch would tear him to ribbons. "Call the guards," Alumide wheezed, forgetting he was a ghost. "The guards do not come for widows," Amina sobbed. "And the chief is feasting." The irony was a bitter root in Alumide's mouth. He looked at the dark forest. He saw eyes, golden, predatory, blinking in the distance. The leopard was near. The sacrifice of skin. Alumide didn't think, he moved. He dropped to his belly, dragging his frail limbs into the belly of the devil's thorns. The first needle pierced his shoulder, a cold shock of pain that turned into a dull, heavy throb. He gasped, his lungs burning. "Stay still, little one," he called out to the boy, who was tangled in the center of the brush, weeping silently. Every inch forward was a payment in blood. The thorn shredded his tattered wrap, biting into his back and legs. He felt the numbing sap entering his veins, making his arms feel like lead. He was an old woman, a beggar, a nothing, and yet, for the first time, he felt like a king protecting his people. He reached the boy. The child was paralyzed with fear. Alumide wrapped his bony arms around him, shielding the boy's face with his own chest. "Climb on my back," Alumide commanded. "Hold tight to my neck. I will be your shield." As he backed out of the thicket, the thorns didn't just scratch, they hooked. They pulled at his flesh as if trying to keep him there. By the time he tumbled out onto the dusty path, his back was a map of red rivers. He collapsed at Amina's feet, the boy safe and untouched. Amina grabbed her son, weeping with joy. She looked at the bloodied beggar woman.
"Why?
Why would you do this for us? We have nothing to give you." Alumide tried to speak, but his throat was dry. A familiar silver light flickered in the air. The boy reached out and touched Alumide's hand. "Thank you, grandmother," he whispered. The second act was complete. The numbing pain in Alumide's body suddenly vanished, replaced by a strange, humming strength. He was still in the rags, but his heart no longer felt like a stone. The river of truth. The next morning, the village was buzzing. The chief, the old woman in disguise, had announced a grand hunt. She demanded that the hunters bring her the head of a white lion, a sacred creature that lived beyond the great river. Alumide, watching from the shadows of the marketplace, knew the truth. The white lion was a protector. To kill it would bring a curse of 7 years of drought upon Oron. He saw the hunters sharpening their spears, led by his own greedy cousins. "You must stop them," Alumide shouted to a group of elders. They laughed. "Look at this one. First she plays hero in the thorns, now she thinks she is a prophet. Go back to your dust, old mother." Alumide realized that his third act wouldn't be a test of muscle, but of truth. He had to cross the Great River, a place where the water spirits were said to strip away all lies. If he could reach the chief before the hunters set out, he might save the kingdom he had once spent his life plundering. He ran toward the riverbank. The water was high, churning with the silt of the rainy season. There was no bridge for Beggar. As he stood at the edge, the old woman, the one inhabiting his body, appeared on the opposite bank. She sat atop a royal horse, surrounded by guards. "Cross, Alumide," she shouted, her voice echoing with the power of 1,000 ancestors. "Cross and tell them who you are. But remember, the river only carries the weight of the soul, not the weight of the gold." He plunged into the water. The current grabbed him like a giant's hand. He began to sink, the weight of his past sins, the stolen lands, the ignored pleas, the arrogance, pulling him down like lead weights tied to his ankles. He had to let go, not of the water, but of the chief, the weight of the crown. The river was not water. It was a liquid memory. As Alumide sank, the current didn't just pull at his limbs. It pulled at his history. He saw the faces of the farmers he had overtaxed. He felt the coldness of the widows he had ignored. Each memory was a stone in his pockets, dragging his borrowed, frail body toward the silted dark of the riverbed. "I am the chief," he tried to roar under the surface, but the water filled his mouth with the taste of ancient earth. The water spirits, shimmering like sun-dappled fish, swarmed around him. They didn't see his indigo silks or his coral beads. They saw a soul cluttered with the debris of pride. To survive, he realized he had to strip. Not of his rags, but of his identity. "I am nothing," he confessed in the silence of his mind. "I am but the breath of the ancestors lent to a piece of clay." The moment the thought took root, the stones vanished. His body became light as a dried reed. The current, once a predator, became a cradle. It lifted him, tossing his ragged form onto the far bank, right at the hooves of the royal horse. The mirror of the soul. Alumide lay coughing on the mud, the chief looking down at him from the saddle. The village elders and the hunters stood in a circle, their spears gleaming. "Look at this creature," the old woman in Alumide's body sneered, her voice dripping with the very arrogance he had practiced for decades. "She dares to interrupt the sacred hunt. She says the white lion should live. What say you, my loyal subjects? Should we listen to a beggar who smells of fish guts and failure?" The crowd jeered. "Kill the lion. The chief commands it." Alumide stood up. He was shivering, his gray hair plastered to his skull. He looked at his own face, the face of the man he used to be, and felt a wave of nausea. He saw the cruelty in the curve of his own mouth. "You can kill the lion," Alumide said, his voice quiet but carrying across the water. "And you can kill me. But look at your leader. Look into his eyes. Does he see your hunger? Does he know the names of your children? Or does he only see the gold you bring him?" The old woman laughed, raising the leopard staff to strike him. "I am the law." "No," Alumide whispered, stepping into the path of the staff. "You are a mask, and I am the one who wore it too long." As the golden staff descended, Alumide didn't flinch. He didn't beg for his life. He reached out and touched the hand of a nearby guard, the same guard he had once whipped for dropping a ceremonial bowl. "I am sorry, Myra," he whispered. "The bowl was fragile, but your spirit was more so." The guard froze. No one knew that name except the man who had broken her pride. The shattering of the indigo. The staff stopped inches from Alumide's head. A wind began to howl from the direction of the forbidden forest, carrying the scent of wild jasmine and predatory musk. The old woman on the horse began to glow with a silver radiance, so bright the hunters shielded their eyes. The horse reared, throwing her to the ground. As she hit the earth, the ground beneath her turned to liquid gold, then back to red clay. "The test is met," A voice boomed, sounding like the cracking of 1,000 dry branches. The transition was agonizing. Alyamide felt his bones stretching, his skin thickening, his strength returning with the force of a tidal wave. But it wasn't the same strength. It didn't feel like a weapon. It felt like a responsibility. When the light faded, Alyamide stood tall in his indigo silks. He was the chief again. But across from him, the beggar woman was also gone. In her place stood the ancestor of the fields, a towering figure draped in living vines and starlight. "You have your skin back, Alyamide," the ancestor said, her voice a soft rustle of leaves. "But look at your hands." He looked. His hands were clean, but the scars from the devil's thorns remained, etched into his palms like silver threads. "The scars are your crown now," she said. "If you forget the beggar, the river will call for you again." With a flash of lightning, she was gone. Alyamide turned to his people, who were trembling in the dust. He didn't call for his horse. He walked to the widow Amina, knelt in the mud, and picked up her fallen basket. "The hunt is cancelled," Alyamide declared. "Today we feast, not for the chief, but for the village." Shall I continue with chapters 13 through 15, where Alyamide must face a rebellion from his own greedy family who prefer the old, cruel chief? The poisoned palm wine. The palace of Oran was no longer a sanctuary for Chief Alyamide, it was a cage of whispers. As he sat upon his throne, no longer demanding the bowed heads of his subjects, his own bloodkin watched him with narrowed, hungry eyes. Tund, his younger brother, stood in the shadows of the great pillars. To Tund, a kind chief was a weak chief. He missed the days when they could seize cattle and gold without question. He missed the fear that tasted like honey. Gourd again. You will be the one to drain it to the dregs. The trial of the empty granary. The drought the ancestor had warned of did not come from the sky, but from the hands of men. Tund and the greedy cousins had hidden the village's emergency grain in the deep caves of the limestone hills, hoping to starve the people into a revolt against the soft chief. By the third moon, the ribs of the village children began to poke through their skin, the same ribs Alyamide had touched when he was a beggar. The elders gathered at the palace gates, their faces grim. "Chief," the oldest elder rasped, leaning on a staff of ebony. "The rains have been kind, but the granaries are empty. The rats have fled, for there is nothing for them to steal. Why does our king eat while the village withers?" Alyamide walked to his own kitchen. He pulled back the heavy raffia curtains. The royal storehouse was empty. Tund had stripped him bare under the cover of night. "I have no grain," Alyamide announced to the gasping crowd. "He lies," Tund shouted from the back of the crowd. "He has sold our lifeblood to the merchants of the north for more coral beads." The crowd surged forward, a wave of desperate, hungry anger. Alyamide didn't call his guards. He didn't raise his leopard staff. He stepped down from the dais and stood amongst them, chest to chest with the men who wanted his head. "Search the palace," Alyamide commanded. "If you find one grain of millet hidden in these walls, take my life. But if you find nothing, then ask yourselves, who among you has been building new walls around their compounds this season?" The song of the earth. The search yielded nothing but dust. The people's anger turned into a cold, hollow confusion. If the chief wasn't stealing, who was? Alyamide closed his eyes. He remembered the old woman's voice in the river. The earth never forgets where the life is buried. He knelt in the center of the village square, pressing his palms, the ones scarred by the devil's thorns, against the dry, cracked soil. "Ancestors," he prayed, his voice a low vibration that seemed to make the very air hum. "I was a beggar who learned to give. Now I am a king who asks to serve. Show us the path to the stolen breath of Oran." A strange thing happened. A line of red ants, thousands of them, began to emerge from the cracks in the earth. They didn't bite. They marched in a perfect, shimmering line toward the limestone hills. "Follow them," Alyamide shouted. The village followed the red line for miles until they reached a hidden cave, sealed with heavy boulders and guarded by Tun's personal mercenaries. When the boulders were rolled away, the scent of fermented grain rushed out like a physical blow. Tund felt his knees, but not in prayer. He fell in shame as the mothers of the village rushed past him to reclaim the food of their children. Alumide stood at the mouth of the cave. He looked at his brother, then at the sky. "The third act was to give my life for the truth," he whispered. "But the fourth act is to show mercy to those who do not deserve it." Instead of execution, Alumide handed Tund a hoe and a tattered loincloth, the very one he had worn in the refuse heap. "You want to be a master, Tund? First, learn to be a servant to the soil." Shall I continue with chapters 16 through 18, where a mysterious plague strikes the cattle and Alumide must journey to the Mountain of Echoes? The breath of the pale moon. The victory at the grain caves was short-lived. A new shadow crept over Oron, one that couldn't be fought with spears or hoes. It began with the cattle, the pride and pulse of the village. The great bulls, with horns like ivory crescents, began to stumble. Their eyes grew milky, and a strange, pale foam gathered at their muzzles. By the time the moon had silvered 3 times, the pastures were silent. No lowing, no bells, only the heavy scent of sickness. "It is the Oforu," the elders whispered in the village square. "The shadow breath. It comes when the land is out of balance. If the cattle die, the people follow." Alumide watched from his balcony as the village grew thin once more. This was not a trial of greed, but a trial of the spirit. That night, the ancestor appeared to him in a dream, her form made of swirling river mist. "The heart of Oron is breaking, Alumide," she sighed. "You saved the grain, but you have not yet healed the soil. To save the herds, you must travel to the Mountain of Echoes. You must find the Heartstone, but the mountain does not take kings. It only takes those who know how to bleed." Alumide woke with the taste of copper in his mouth. He knew what he had to do. He didn't call for his royal guard or his ivory-inlaid litter. He stripped off his indigo agbada, leaving it in a heap on the throne. He put on the simple, rough-spun cloth of a common traveler and took up a gourmand's staff. "Where are you going, brother?" Tund asked from the dirt where he was weeding. His voice was no longer sharp with hate, but heavy with confusion. "To find the breath we lost," Alumide replied. "Watch the gates, Tund. Not as a master, but as a brother. The mountain that mimics." The journey to the Mountain of Echoes took 6 days through the great scrub. The sun was a hammer, and the earth was the anvil. Alumide's feet, once soft from years of being carried, began to blister and crack. Each step felt like a needle from the devil's thorns, but he did not stop. The mountain rose from the plains like a jagged tooth. It was said that the mountain was alive, that it listened to the thoughts of those who climbed it and played them back as reality. As Alumide began the ascent, the air grew thin and cold. Suddenly, he heard a voice. "You are a fool, Alumide." He spun around. Standing on a ledge above him was himself. Not the man in rags, but the arrogant chief he used to be, draped in gold and sneering. "Why suffer?" the phantom chief asked. "Go back. Use your remaining gold to buy cattle from the southern tribes. Let the poor die. They are replaceable. You are a king. Kings do not climb in the dirt." Alumide felt the weight of his old life pulling at his soul. The phantom offered him a hand, and for a moment, the comfort of his old, cold heart felt like a warm blanket. But then he looked at his palms. He saw the silver scars from the widow's son and the child's half-ear of corn. "A king who does not climb in the dirt," Alumide shouted to the echoing rocks, "has no right to stand on the mountain." The phantom shattered into 1,000 gray pebbles. The path steepened, and the wind began to howl, sounding like the cries of every person he had ever wronged. He had to climb through the sound of his own sins. The price of the Heartstone. Near the summit, Alumide found a cave illuminated by a soft, pulsing red light. Inside, embedded in a wall of pure obsidian, was the Heartstone, a gem that looked like a drop of the sun's blood. It was the source of the land's vitality. But the stone was guarded, not by a lion or a spirit, but by a chasm. The gap between the ledge and the stone was 10 paces wide. Below it was a void that seemed to swallow all light. There was no bridge. To bridge the gap, a voice echoed from the walls. One must give what they cannot regain. Alumide looked at his hands. He looked at his life. He realized the mountain wasn't asking for gold or blood. It was asking for his story. To reach the stone, he had to jump, knowing that if his heart wasn't truly changed, the void would take him. He thought of the old woman with the soup stain. He thought of the dog that shared its bread. He realized that Arthur Sterling and Chief Alumide were the same man, men who thought they were the sun when they were merely mirrors. "I give my pride to the wind," Alumide whispered. He didn't jump with strength, he stepped out with faith. As his foot left the solid rock, the shadows in the chasm rose up, solidifying under his feet. The cries of his victims became a solid bridge of sound. Their pain, which he had finally acknowledged, now supported him. He reached the heartstone. As his fingers touched the warm, vibrating surface, the mountain shivered. A surge of energy roared through him, turning his silver scars into glowing lines of light. The stone didn't come loose. Instead, it dissolved into his chest. He was no longer just the chief. He was the heart of Oron. As he turned to descend, he saw the first clouds of the great rain gathering over the horizon. The cattle would live. The land would breathe. But as he looked down at his hands, he saw they were changing once more. The indigo silk was returning, but it was different. It was woven with the threads of the rags he had worn. Shall I continue with chapters 19 through 21, the final chapters where Alumide returns to find a final test of his soul? The return of the Rainbringer. The descent from the Mountain of Echoes was not a walk, but a transformation. As Alumide moved through the great scrub, the sky finally broke. Not with a drizzle, but with a thunderous, cleansing downpour that turned the dust into a rich, chocolate-colored womb. The air, once heavy with the scent of the shadow breath, was suddenly sweet with the smell of wet stone and rising grass. When Alumide reached the outskirts of Oron, he did not look like a king. He was drenched, his fine silks clinging to his frame, his feet caked in the red clay of the journey. But as he passed the first of the cattle pens, a miracle occurred. The dying bulls, whose eyes had been clouded with the milk of death, shuddered. They stood, their lungs pumping out the pale foam, replaced by the deep, rhythmic bellows of life. The villagers rushed out of their huts, falling to their knees, not in fear, but in awe. They saw the glow beneath the chief's skin, the heartstone's light shimmering through his chest like a lantern behind a silk curtain. "The chief has returned the breath," the cry went up. But Alumide did not head for the palace. He walked to the village center, where the widow Amina and the elder stood. He stopped before the very spot where he had once humiliated the old woman. "The cat alive," Alumide announced, his voice sounding like the roll of distant thunder. "But the land is still sick. It is sick because the palace still sits higher than the people. From this day, the palace gates shall be removed. The king's granary is the village's granary." Tund stepped forward, his face clean of the dirt he had been working. He looked at his brother and saw a stranger, a man whose eyes held the depth of the great river. "Brother," Tund whispered, "the people are ready to worship you." "That," Alumide said, "is the final poison. The shadow of the golden leopard." As the moon rose over the rejuvenated kingdom, a cold wind swept through the palace. Alumide sat alone in the great hall, the heartstone humming against his ribs. Suddenly, the shadows in the corner detached themselves. The beggar woman stood there. She was no longer a frail old thing, but a towering figure of silver and shadow, the ancestor of Karma herself. In her hand, she held a mirror made of polished obsidian. "The 3 acts are finished, Alumide," she said, her voice a chorus of 1,000 spirits. "The boy is saved, the grain is returned, and the heartstone is yours. You have earned your life back. You have earned your power." She held up the mirror. "Look into it and you may choose. You can remain as you are, a man who feels the pain of every blade of grass, Or you can return to the man you were before the soup stained your shoes. You can have your cold heart back. You can have the power that never trembles, the wealth that never doubts. Alumide looked into the obsidian. He saw his old self, the sharp jaw, the eyes that looked at people as tools, the magnificent, unscarred hands. He saw a life of absolute comfort, free from the crushing weight of empathy. He saw Arthur Sterling in his penthouse, laughing at the world below. Then he felt the scars on his palms. He felt the memory of the child's half-ear of corn. The man in the mirror is a ghost, Alumide said. He has everything, yet he owns nothing, for he does not even own his own soul. I choose the rags and the silk. I choose the heart that breaks. The ancestor smiled, and for the first time, her face was not terrifying. Then the test is truly over. But remember, karma is not a punishment. It is a mirror. What you give, you become. The pearl and the shell. The next morning, the sun rose over Oron with a gentleness that felt like a blessing. Chief Alumide stood on his balcony, watching the village come to life. Children played in the puddles. The fishmonger shared her catch with those who had no silver. The drums began a rhythm of gratitude. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, smooth stone, the last remnant of the Heartstone's physical form. He walked down into the street, alone and without guards. In the gutter, near the spot where the oil had once spilled, sat a stranger. A young man, dressed in the fine, arrogant clothes of a distant city, looking confused and angry as he brushed dust off his sleeves. He looked up at Alumide, his eyes full of the same fire Arthur Sterling once carried. "You," the young man snapped.